Ancient Egyptians got higher than you'd ever believe. The hot sun rises slowly over the Nile Delta. You can imagine yourself standing in the middle of an early morning village along the riverbank. The year roughly 2500 BCE. The air is already warm, carrying the smell of clay, mud, and faint traces of honey wine fermenting in small pots. This was not a land of constant pharaoh processions and grand tomb constructions. It was mostly, day after day, a quiet rhythm of survival. You'd see men and women waking early, binding sandals made of woven reeds before stepping into the fertile black soil. The people here weren't rushing to build pyramids. They were mostly farmers, bakers, brewers, and basket weavers. The grand monuments came from this humble labor, but the daily grind, it was long, repetitive, and quietly fascinating. Life revolving around the river. The Nile was the clock. Its floods dictated when you planted, harvested, or waited. For months, the fields would lie underwater, and villagers would patch boats from papyrus stalks to float supplies. When the waters receded, they left rich silt behind, a gift that made Egypt a breadbasket for centuries. But the process was slow and required patience. Farmers worked bent-backed with copper hoes that dulled quickly, needing regular sharpening on stones. Every morning they trudged through narrow irrigation channels, sometimes barefoot, making sure water reached every corner of the crop beds. A single misstep could leave a field dry and useless. The quiet role of religion. Life was tedious, but there was comfort in routine rituals. Temples didn't just hold ceremonies for the gods. They managed food distribution, grain storage, and even medical advice. A farmer with a toothache might visit a priest-physician who would prescribe ground herbs mixed with incense. Burned in every corner of society, not for luxury, but for practical reasons. It masked the smell of livestock and kept flies away. Ancient papyri mention mixtures of lotus, blue water lily, and other plants that, when burned or brewed into wine, provided not just aroma, but a curious sense of calm and, as modern research hints, mild intoxication. Workshops of slow innovation. While you might picture bustling markets, much of Egyptian trade involved long waits. A potter's workshop, for instance, was a study in patience. Clay had to be soaked, kneaded, shaped, dried, fired in uneven kilns, painted and fired again. If one step failed, the whole jar was useless. In weaving huts, looms creaked endlessly as women pulled fibers from flax. Linen production wasn't glamorous. It involved soaking stalks until they rotted slightly, then pounding them and spinning thread, often for weeks, to make a single bolt of cloth. Early experiments with plants. This is where the story becomes unexpectedly intriguing. Ancient records describe not only food and drink, but concoctions from wild plants. Egyptian brewers added blue lotus to wine, a flower that contained mild psychoactive properties. Honey mead was sometimes infused with herbs known to relax muscles or induce dreamlike states. temple murals even show gatherings where people drank heavily, danced awkwardly, shadows melting into darkness, and played music deep into the night. Archaeological residues found in jars suggest that certain parties may have been more than just celebrations. They were altered states of consciousness, a strange escape from the repetitive nature of ancient labor. But how common was this practice? Was it an elite privilege or something villagers experienced after a long harvest? Modern historians debate. As evidence is scattered, and interpretation relies heavily on art and to seek moments of altered reality, even 4,500 years ago. As you sit by the river in your mind, watching the slow ferries float downstream and listening to the distant bleating of goats, you might wonder, if the common Egyptian farmer lived such a monotonous life, why did they turn to plants and brews that lifted them into different states of mind? And what exactly did those ancient experiences feel like? Brewing, rituals, and the subtle art of intoxication. The Nile winds lazily through the land as days blend into one another, with farmers tending their fields and artisans quietly shaping the tools of daily life. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a different rhythm began to stir, a more private and curious tradition that blended sustenance, medicine, and altered consciousness. In this section, we descend deeper, dreamlike states. Brewing in ancient Egypt, a slow, careful process. Beer in ancient Egypt was not the foamy golden drink you might imagine today. Instead, it was thick, sweet, and far more nourishing than intoxicating. At least, at first. Daily beer was a staple, consumed by men, women, and even children because it was safer than stagnant water. But brewing was a craft, and its long, deliberate steps reveal how Egyptian people handled fermentation. Brewers started by baking a type of bread made specifically for beer. This bread wasn't for eating. It was half-cooked, packed with yeast, and crumbled into large clay vats. There, it was mixed with water, and sometimes flavored with dates or honey. The mixture would sit under the hot sun for days, naturally fermenting, while brewers stirred it with long reeds to prevent spoilage. When the liquid was strained and stored, it created a drink both nutritious and lightly intoxicating. For daily laborers, it was simply food in liquid form, offering calories for long hours in the fields. But in temple gatherings or private celebrations, brewers altered recipes, adding blue lotus petals, mandrake root, or fermented honey to elevate the effects. The process wasn't rushed. Each stage, baking, fermenting, straining, cooling, required patience, often stretching over weeks. Brewing vessels had to be carefully sealed to avoid contamination from desert sandstorms. This meant that every sip of enhanced beer or wine carried not only intoxication, but also the quiet weight of long, deliberate labor. Blue lotus and other altering plants, Among the reeds along the Nile grew blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, a water lily with hypnotic beauty. Its soft blue petals opened with the sun and closed at dusk. Egyptians saw it as sacred, symbolizing rebirth and the sun's journey. But beyond its beauty, it carried mild psychoactive properties. When petals were soaked in wine or brewed into teas, they released compounds that relaxed muscles and induced euphoria. Murals depict nobles reclining on couches, drinking wine, while attendants bring more lotus flowers, a scene interpreted by scholars as early recreational intoxication. But blue lotus wasn't the only plant with such effects. Mandrake fruits, known for their sedative qualities, were sometimes mashed into honey. Henbane and other herbs in small doses were used in rituals meant to open the mind during temple ceremonies. None of these ingredients created hallucinogenic experiences as we think of them today. Instead, they produced gentle, dreamlike states, a floaty sensation where time blurred and conversation softened. For people whose lives were bound by sunrise and sunset, sowing and reaping, these moments must have felt like stepping into a ritualistic use and temple gatherings. The intoxicating brews and plants were not only for personal relaxation. Religious life in Egypt often wove intoxication into worship. Temples dedicated to Hathor, goddess of music, joy, and fertility, were famous for festival of drunkenness celebrations. Once a year, in honor of a myth where humanity was saved from divine wrath through intoxication, Egyptians gathered in temple courtyards to drink, dance, and experience altered states together. Hymns were sung, sistrums rattled, drums echoed into the night. The idea was not debauchery, but communion with gods, a ritual loosening of ordinary perception to connect with divine presence. Priests and priestesses prepared brews with blue lotus and other herbs, offering them to participants as part of sacred rites. These gatherings could last several days, blending religious ecstasy with the mundane pleasure of food, music, and communal rest. Even outside official festivals, private homes sometimes hosted smaller gatherings. Archaeological finds show drinking cups stained with residues of both wine and lotus extracts, suggesting quiet, intimate moments of mild intoxication, shared among friends and family after harvests or during long, hot summers. The subtlety of ancient intoxication. Modern readers might imagine something intense, wild revelry, or powerful psychedelic journeys. But in reality, ancient Egyptian intoxication was slow, muted, and deeply tied to the environment. Fermentation was limited. Alcohol levels were low. The psychoactive plants used were gentle by design. What mattered wasn't escape or excess. It was moderation, ritual, and shared experience. The slow brewing process, the tender plucking of lotus petals at dawn, the grinding of mandrake into honey, all of these actions slowed time, made people attentive to their world. Farmers worked for months under relentless sun, their backs aching from bending over crops. When the harvest came and brewers finally poured golden beer, infused with fragrant lotus, it wasn't just a drink. It was a momentary relief from monotony, a glimpse into something transcendent that couldn't be found in plowing or grinding grain. Impact on social life and hierarchies. Interestingly, access to certain brews and herbs hinted at one's social standing. Common laborers drank simple beer, but wealthier households could afford wine enhanced with lotus or rare spices from trade caravans. Temple rituals were open to many, but the most potent mixtures were often reserved for priests and nobles, considered spiritually or politically significant. This created a subtle hierarchy of intoxication. The deeper, dreamlike experiences belonged to those with influence, while the working majority settled for mild, sustaining beer. Yet even within these limits, shared drinking bound communities together. From workers resting after quarrying stone for pyramids, to artisans celebrating a completed batch of linen, the act of drinking and its calming effects softened social tensions and strengthened bonds. An echo across time. As night fell on the Nile, villagers gathered under simple canopies, lamps flickering with oil. Cups passed slowly from hand to hand. Someone hummed a tune, and laughter, soft, not raucous, broke the still air. The fatigue of irrigation and mud brick building faded, just enough to allow talk of dreams, gods, and the whisper of stars overhead. These were not scenes of chaos, but of quiet transformation. A community escaping the dull edges of survival through carefully crafted brews and nature's subtle gifts. This understated relationship with intoxication endured for millennia, influencing medicine, ritual, and even political negotiations within temple walls. But we have only seen a glimpse, because behind every clay jar and faded mural, there remains a deeper mystery. What truly happened inside those inner temple chambers, hidden from common eyes, where priests prepared secret mixtures and engaged in rituals that might have gone far beyond the quiet communal drinking of ordinary Egyptians. The hidden chambers, elite rituals, and spiritual highs. You've walked along the Nile with the farmers. You sat in the evening shadows of mud brick houses, watching lotus-infused wine loosen the bonds of daily fatigue. But now, as you step through the high gates of an ancient temple, you enter a different world entirely. One not meant for ordinary villagers. This is where Egyptian intoxication reached its most secretive and spiritually potent heights. The sacred architecture of intoxication, inside temples dedicated to Hathor, Osiris, or Ra. Corridors narrowed, walls painted with intricate depictions of gods dancing, offering cups of wine and embracing the blue lotus. Beyond the public courtyards, where common celebrations and festivals took place, lay smaller chambers, dimly lit, echoing faintly with chants and the soft beat of drums. These were ritual spaces where only priests, priestesses, and select nobles entered. To step inside was to leave the concerns of fields and markets behind and enter a space designed to alter the mind. It wasn't just about worship, it was about controlled transformation. Massive incense burners released swirling clouds of resinous smoke. Some scents, like frankincense and myrrh, were common, but others carried subtler properties. Henbane, when burned carefully, released compounds that induced mild sedation and heightened sensory perception. Combined with rhythmic chanting and hypnotic drum beats, these spaces became worlds within worlds. Preparation of sacred brews. The preparation of temple brews was an elaborate process that could take weeks. Priests mixed honey wine with blue lotus petals, sometimes soaking them for months to concentrate their properties. Mandrake fruits, dried and ground fenugreek, perfumed the mixture. The result was a thick, sweet, intoxicating drink, unlike the beer of common folk. It wasn't consumed casually. Each sip was measured, offered with chants, and accompanied by ritual gestures. Some ceremonies required participants to fast beforehand, allowing the body to absorb the effects more deeply. These brews were believed to unlock visions, glimpses of gods walking among mortals, journeys through the underworld, or prophetic dreams that guided temple decisions and royal decrees. Modern analyses of residue from ancient chalices suggest not just alcohol, but traces of compounds from psychoactive plants, giving weight to the idea that Egyptian spirituality was entwined with carefully induced altered states. Mysteries of the inner temple. We know only fragments of what occurred inside these hidden chambers. Texts carved into stone hint at night journeys and holy awakenings. Some inscriptions describe priests their own, or claiming to have seen the sun god travel through darkness. Participants often reclined on low couches, while attendants played harps and rattled sistrums in gentle, repetitive patterns. The atmosphere wasn't frenzied. It was slow, deliberate, and dreamlike. Imagine lying there, the warm air heavy with incense, the rhythmic sound of water dripping into stone basins, and the gradual unfolding of visions brought on by herbal infusions and deep meditation. Some scholars believe these rituals influenced the design of tombs and pyramids themselves. The corridors leading to burial chambers mirrored the spiritual journeys described by priests in trance. Narrow passages leading upward, echoing the soul's ascent to the afterlife. Political and spiritual power. These intoxicating rituals weren't only spiritual. They reinforced political control. Pharaohs were not just rulers, but living gods, intermediaries between people and deities. Temple rituals elevated this divine status. A pharaoh or high priest underwent a vision-inducing ceremony. Emerging with proclamations from the gods, it strengthened their authority. Priests who mastered these altered states could interpret omens, bless military campaigns, or dictate agricultural policies based on perceived divine guidance. This gave temples enormous power, often rivaling that of the royal court. To maintain this influence, knowledge of the most potent mixtures and rituals was kept strictly within priestly ranks, passed down like sacred treasures. Echoes of ancient psychedelic wisdom. What's fascinating is how similar these practices are to ritual intoxication in other ancient cultures. In Greece, the Oracle of Delphi inhaled fumes to deliver prophecies. In Mesoamerica, shamans consumed plants to enter trance states. Across the ancient world, human societies independently discovered ways to shift perception, often linking these experiences with the divine. In Egypt, the process was subtle and refined, less about overwhelming visions and more about controlled, sustained immersion in altered consciousness. Priests didn't seek chaos, but clarity, a quiet, heightened state that allowed communion with gods and ancestors. Decline and legacy. As centuries passed and Egypt came under foreign rule, first Persians, then Greeks, and finally Romans, temple practices changed. Some rituals persisted, but others faded. By the time Christian and Islamic influences reached the Nile, intoxicating plant rituals had nearly vanished from public life. Yet, their legacy lived on. Fragments of blue lotus motifs remained in religious art. Ancient medical texts preserved knowledge of herbs once used for visions. And in modern times, when archaeologists unearthed residues of these brews, it reignited fascination with how ancient people approached altered states, not as rebellion or recreation, but as structured, modern reflections. Today, when you hear ancient Egyptians got higher than you'd ever believe, it's tempting to imagine wild parties or mystical hallucinations. The truth is far more nuanced and perhaps more interesting. Intoxication in Egypt was deliberate, measured, and deeply woven into the fabric of life and spirituality. From the muddy beer pots of common farmers to the secret chalices of temple priests, Egyptians used plants and fermentation not to escape reality, but to understand it more deeply. They softened the harshness of survival, forged bonds between communities, and sought glimpses of the divine through carefully crafted, ritualized states of mind. So, as you imagine yourself drifting through those candlelit temple chambers, the scent of lotus and incense filling the air, you might wonder, have we, in our modern haste for stronger, faster highs, lost the gentle, sacred way ancient people once used altered states to feel connected to each other, to nature, and perhaps even to the gods themselves?